Nurses are often a cipher for life and nurturing, and many are passionately dedicated to their caring profession. Here are two accounts of ghost nurses who can't seem to move on from carrying out their eerie night shift duties. Recently, the Austin Hospital, a major health facility in Melbourne, Australia, shared accounts of one hard-working resident ghost known as the Grey Nurse. Over the years, the very active spectre has been sighted wearing a grey nurse's uniform dating back to a bygone era. The spiritual presence is a very dedicated nurse who has decided to stay on shift long after she departed the earthly realm. The Grey Nurse is a friendly ghost who actually provides care to patients and carries out good deeds such as pressing the call buzzer for patients who are unable to. Many unexplained occurrences have been reported by nursing staff over decades. 30 years ago, the now Divisional Director for Cancer and Neurosciences, Cherie Cheshire, was on night shift on the neurology ward, working in the 3KZ building at Austin Hospital. Although there were supposed to be 3 nurses on night shift, that night they were short-staffed and only had 2. One patient called Carol had complete paralysis caused by MS. She was unable to take a drink of water herself, but suffered from a very dry mouth. Consequently, the nursing staff attended to her at least hourly to assist her in sipping some water, even overnight. During this shift, the nurses were flat out. At about 9:30 p.m, Cherie filled Carol's 1-litre jug with iced water and then gave her a drink. However, it became very busy and she didn't manage to get back to Carol's room until midnight. By that time, Carol only had half a jug of water, and she told Cherie that the other nurse had been in several times to help her drink. Cherie was puzzled by this and checked with the other nurse, who said she had not entered Carol's room. When Cherie asked Carol about who helped her with drinking her water again, she said it was the older agency nurse wearing the old-fashioned grey dress. Another former Austin Hospital ICU manager, Jen Hancock, became aware of the helpful Grey Nurse presence back in 1977. She was working night shifts on the old 6A ward in Heidelberg House when the buzzer rang and a female patient needed a pan. She took it to her and asked her to buzz when she was finished. 10 minutes later, Jen had still heard no buzz, so went back to check. The woman was lying down in bed half asleep with her curtains pulled back. She told Jen that the other nurse, wearing a grey uniform with a veil, had removed the bedpan and made her comfortable. At the time, Jen was working with a male enrolled nurse, so then asked the registered nurse overseeing 3 wards in Heidelberg House if she knew of any other nurses there in a different uniform. She didn't. Jen was later told that the Grey Nurse was a common occurrence in Heidelberg House and that patients there had often described their encounters with her. Another nurse unit manager named Karen Owen has also reported unexplained occurrences from when she worked in the Harold Stokes building at the Austin Hospital. She related that when heading up the dark corridor in the building on Ward 7B, there would always be a distinct cold feeling when she attended beds 1 and 2. On many occasions, the intravenous therapy or nasogastric feeding pumps would alarm, but by the time she reached them, she would find them silenced and reset without any staff having been there. The nurses often commented that the Grey Nurse must have seen to them. Service Planning Project Officer Kate Ireland also heard many accounts while nursing at the affiliated Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital. She had first heard about the Grey Nurse many years previously when she was a graduate nurse, and as the apparition only seemed to appear at night, the night duty staff would share their experiences. The Grey Nurse was reputed to be very kind, placing blankets over patients when they were cold, assisting them to drink water when they couldn't manage it themselves, and even helping patients onto a bedpan when the other nurses were busy. Kate says that while most of the Grey Nurse's work was not witnessed, some night duty nurses would say that they had occasionally glimpsed sightings of her. The wards had long corridors that were very dark at night, and she had been seen down at the end of the corridor just before she turned a corner. Of course, when witnesses went to look, there was never anybody to be seen. Many nurses have a lifetime of dedication, but some seem so passionate about their work that they continue their service after stumps. Perhaps many haunt the wards and corridors of their previous existence, continuing to pursue their profession. Kami Walker is an ex-nurse and now Vative Healthcare CEO who grew up always knowing that nursing was her vocation. She spent her early days training in the extremely old hospitals in England, which brought her in contact with a number of experiences that were quite out of the ordinary. She has told of an occurrence in one of these hospitals where she was working night duty with another nurse in the Florence Nightingale ward. Between them, they were looking after 30 patients whose beds were behind curtains. One night in the old ward, they very clearly heard the big doors into the ward open. Kami said that there was no mistaking the sound, as the doors were massive and made a very distinct noise. The two nurses both assumed that it was the night sister entering to do her rounds, and they were waiting for her to poke her head between one of the curtains so as to say hello. However, they eventually grew suspicious after not seeing or hearing anything, so they looked out from behind the curtain and saw a startling figure. The strange moving object looked like an old nurse, making her way up the ward. Kami continued that the person they were observing was wearing the old-style big hat and antiquated uniform with the large cape. The bizarre aspect of this apparition was that they could see the figure from only the knees up. As they found out later, many people had seen the same apparition, and it was believed that she was the ghost of an old former night nurse, still doing her rounds. The reason that witnesses could see her only from her knees up was because the floor of the ward had been renovated. The ghost of the nurse was still walking along on the old floor, below the one that the living were actually walking on. Kami came to understand that the ghost of this former nurse was well known within the hospital and that everyone saw her every so often. It was simply believed that she was just an old nurse walking along her ward in her time, but a strong, moving image that seems imprinted in our reality. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey.
If you work in a hospital, there is a chance that you may eventually encounter a spirit, and there have been many doctors, nurses and patients who will attest to the fact that they have seen a genuine ghost. It is no wonder that spirits may abound in hospitals, because other than births, it is a place where most people come to the end stage of their life. The following story is about a young Australian man who, whilst living in London in the 1950s, encountered something that was definitely otherworldly. The following strange incident happened to an Australian man by the name of Ian Jones. Ian was born in Melbourne in 1931 and became a journalist on a Melbourne newspaper called the Sun News Victorial. In January 1956, like many young Australians, he headed to England when he was 24, where he wanted to study television. In those days, most people living in Australia travelled by ship, and Ian went on an ocean liner called Strathaired. The voyage to London would take him 1 month, and after working 3 chaotic years as a journalist, the month-long voyage was pure joy filled with much sun-soaking and leisure. Ian spent most of his leisure time walking around the decks in his bare feet, but unfortunately a blood blister formed under a callus on one of his toes, and his toe became badly infected, and despite being treated by the ship's doctor with penicillin injections, he arrived in London with a very painful and swollen foot. He made his way to Earl's Court in Kensington, which in those days was full of expat Australians. Unfortunately, because his foot was so badly infected, he became an outpatient at the nearby St Mary Abbott's Hospital. Whilst being treated, he started to suffer with terrible back pain every time he breathed, and because his infected foot had worsened, he had to be admitted to the hospital. Shortly after entering the ward, he had another painful episode of back pain where a nurse had to give him morphine before officially checking him into the hospital. When the morphine started to kick in, he started to feel euphoric. After much care by the nurses and hospital staff, he would eventually recover, but was told that his back pain was caused by pleurisy, where a spot on his lung had become infected. He was advised that he had been seriously ill. One evening, while still recovering in the ward, he decided he wanted to try and have a normal night's sleep, so he declined any painkillers or sleeping pills. His room was in darkness, apart from the lights coming from the courtyard below, which shone up through the curtains that bathed the room with a soft glow. At this point, he fortunately had no discomfort and was feeling totally relaxed and felt himself slowly drifting off to sleep. But suddenly, he had a strange feeling that there was someone else in the room, and as he opened his eyes, he saw a nurse at the foot of his bed. He first figured that she'd come into the room to check on his welfare and whether he'd fallen asleep. She appeared to be turning to leave, but as she turned towards the door, she quickly glanced back at him. Ian was about to say to her, "It's okay, I'm not asleep," when several things came to his attention, and he thought, "This is not a nurse that I recognise." She was blonde and not wearing the normal starched folded headwear that he usually saw at the hospital, and she was not wearing an apron. She was dressed nothing like the nurses that had been regularly seeing in St Mary's Abbott's hospital. The uniform on this particular nurse was in navy blue with light-coloured piping that made her look like she belonged to the military. But there was one particular detail that stood out with the nurse, and that only her head and shoulders were visible, which appeared to be level with the top of the slightly open door. But where was the rest of her? He had no sooner registered what was happening when she abruptly vanished. Ian was left staring at an empty space that the nurse had once occupied, and quickly turned on the light to get more clarity, but there was nothing to be seen. He listened for any possible sound of her footsteps, but all he could hear was someone coughing in another ward. He checked the time of the incident and recorded it in his diary, where he wrote the heading "Ghost Nurse" and lay back on his pillow, contemplate the strange thing he'd just experienced. However, the image of the blonde nurse in military-style uniform stayed with him till he drifted off to sleep. The following morning, one of the regular nurses entered his room, called Sister Brady, and he asked her whether St Mary Abbott's hospital was haunted. The nurse was not at all perturbed by his unusual question, and replied in a lilting Irish accent, "And which one have you seen, Mr Jones?" She then told him that the hospital had several ghosts, including an old man who wears a nightshirt who was often seen wandering around the wards. New nurses often make comments about him. The senior staff were well aware of his presence and did not want the new nurses to worry when on night duty. They said that he knew who he was and would often see him. When Ian described the ghost nurse in detail and the unusual uniform she was wearing, Sister Brady looked at him with a curious expression and said, "No one has ever described that particular nurse to me. However, the nurse you are describing fits the image of an auxiliary nurse who was killed in the hospital during an air raid in 1944. Ian said that he was left with a mystery as to why a nurse who had been dead for 12 years specifically visited him when nobody else had ever seen her. He believes the answer lies in the fact that he was visited by the nurse because he'd been very close to death. He was advised by a specialist that his pleurisy had been caused by infected material from his toe entering his bloodstream, forcing its way into his left lung, which caused agonizing pain and almost killed him. The specialist said that his life had been in great danger. Ian believes the ghost nurse only visits those whose life was in grave danger, and when she saw he was out of harm's way, she left the room. Ian feels that other patients have also probably seen her, but they did not live to tell of their experience, because they died before they could tell anyone. Ian Jones saw her and lived to tell the tale. Ian later returned to his hometown in Melbourne, Australia, and went on to become a successful television writer and director, and was also an author who specialised in the history of notorious Australian bushranger Ned Kelly and his gang. Unfortunately, Ian Jones passed away on the 31st of August 2018 at the age of 86. Number 1 Greenbank Terrace in Devon, England had once been a nursing home for the elderly, but had been sold and became a rented accommodation. The first tenants to move into the old house were the Chapman family, which consisted of the mother, Marjorie Chapman, and her two sons, Mark and George, who were both in their late 30s. Marjorie Chapman was an elderly widow whose health was rather fragile, and her sons did their best to accommodate her. Their first year in the house went without any problems, until one day Mark was not feeling particularly well and had come home early from work and had taken himself off to bed. In the evening, Mark found he was extremely restless and had trouble sleeping and was in a feverish state and threw off his blankets, even though the room was very cool and the outside windows were frosted over. Eventually, Mark drifted off to sleep, and in the early hours of the morning, he could barely make out the sounds of two women talking somewhere in the room. The conversation between the women seemed to last for a long while, and at times he just wished they would be quiet. But because he was in a feverish state, could not bring himself to wake up. It was not until he heard one of the women mention his name that he attempted to rouse himself, but was unable to. He then tried to make out what they were saying, and managed to hear, "He's not well, you know. Keep an eye on him, and see to those blankets, nurse." The very next moment, Mark felt the blankets being pulled over and the edges being tucked in all around him. He could actually feel the mattress being lifted around him as his body rolled. He knew that this was not his mother or brother, so who was talking and who had adjusted his blankets? When Mark awoke the following morning, he was still feeling unwell and had to fight to get out of bed because the blankets were still tight all around him. When Mark thought about what had happened the previous night, he was totally confused, as he was a tall and heavy man, so it would have taken much effort to lift the mattress and tuck him in, yet they appeared to do it with ease. When Mark was seated at the breakfast table, he asked his mother whether she'd come in his bedroom during the night and tucked him in. She laughed at him, asking where he'd got such an absurd notion, and said it had been many years since she'd tucked him into bed. Mark never doubted what his mother had said, and besides, the previous night he had heard two women talking in his room, and one of them had called the other one nurse. That night he went to bed still feeling unwell, but was feeling much better than the night before, and was able to drift off to sleep. But in the early hours he was again awoken by chattering female voices, but then drifted off to sleep without having his blankets adjusted around him. He decided not to bring it up with his mother or brother for fear of being ridiculed. Over the weeks, he forgot about the strange incident, but 2 weeks before Christmas, Mark had the same experience when he woke up and saw an unusual glow in the corner of his bedroom, which he described as pearl grey and apricot in colour. This time, he was fully awake and not in any dream state, but his body felt extremely heavy. As he was staring at the translucent glow, a figure appeared to take shape, which slowly became more visible, till Mark was able to make out a thin old man wearing a nightshirt with a nightcap on his head. Instead of being terrified of this weird apparition, he found it quite amusing. The little old man then stood on a stool and was stretching his arms, as if he was lifting something over his head. But the funny apparition turned to horror when he realised the man was attempting to hang himself, and he felt helpless and could not move or say anything. Mark then felt relieved when a woman suddenly appeared through the bedroom door, dressed in a nursing's uniform. She was calm and assertive, stating, "Now then, Mr. Dexter, come along back to bed with you." She then held out her arms to the man and said, "That's it, take my hand." Mark could only watch in both fascination and horror at the performance that was playing out in front of him. At first, it appeared as if the old man was going to ignore her orders, but eventually took her hand and then she led him away. The strange glow then ebbed away, and Mark found himself again in darkness. Had Mark just relived an event that had taken place many years before? The whole drama could not have lasted for more than a few minutes, but now he was wide awake and was unable to get back to sleep, so he went downstairs to make himself a hot drink. He would not sleep again that night, and if this ghostly scenario was to become a regular event, he would have to change bedrooms, or he would never be able to get any sleep. Fortunately for Mark, the next 2 weeks would be quiet and peaceful. However, his next paranormal encounter would not be at night in his bedroom, but in the middle of the day in the kitchen. It was Christmas Eve, and Mark had left work early and returned home to find his mother cooking in the kitchen and was removing some mince pies from the oven. Mark told his mother to have a break while he made them both a cup of tea. As they were talking, his mother said she'd be having a night out, where a friend would be coming over to take her out to bingo. His mother had no sooner finished talking when Mark nearly dropped his mug as the nurse suddenly appeared behind his mother. The ghostly apparition was surrounded by a red glow and was shaking her head as if she was warning him about something, and then vanished. Mark just stared at his mother, but it was obvious that she had not sensed the nurse's presence as she continued to talk about her night out. Rather than being horrified at the sight of the nurse, Mark was now concerned and saw her appearance as a warning of some sort, and then asked his mother whether she was feeling well. His mother looked at him confused and said, "Yes, I feel well. Why, do I look unwell?" Mark said she looked fine, but thought because it was such a cold night, she should relax in front of the fire instead. She disagreed and said she would be picked up in a warm car and then dropped off in a warm car. That evening, Mark was feeling uneasy and became extremely concerned when it was midnight and his mother had not returned home. At 1 a.m, there was a knock on the door, and Mark's fears were confirmed when he opened the door to find a policeman standing there. He informed Mark that his mother had been involved in a car accident and was in the hospital. Mark was now angry with himself for not heeding the nurse's warning and should have forced his mother to stay at home. His mother was in the hospital for 3 weeks and returned home to make a full recovery. The following year was quiet for Mark, and for many months he was not haunted by the nurse or any other staff or patients until September. One Saturday afternoon, Mark was sitting peacefully watching sports on the television while his mother was asleep on the sofa while his brother George was out with his girlfriend. At 1 p.m, Mark decided to make himself a cup of tea, and as he was at the kitchen bench, looked back to see the nurse standing near the TV wearing a starched uniform. Mark's body just stiffened, wondering what horrific event was now about to happen. Then he heard a loud crash that was so loud that he thought a wall had fallen down. He looked across at his mother, who was still asleep, and the nurse had vanished. He looked around the room, but everything looked normal. Short time later, a policeman knocked on the door, informing Mark and his mother that his brother had been involved in a car accident that afternoon but was only slightly injured. Mark was not surprised and had been prepared for the event as he had already been warned. His brother stayed overnight in the hospital and returned home the following day. Nevertheless, Mark had had enough and managed to get the family to move to another house where Mark never saw the nurse again. The whole time he was living at the house, he was the only person ever to see the nurse or any other apparition, and no doubt was unaware that he possessed psychic abilities.